Welcome again to the conference, Ethics After the Holocaust. My name is Martha Ravitz of the Women's Studies program of the University of Oregon. Our speaker today is Professor Jill Robbins of the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her address is titled The Frozen Face. To wrestle with the problem of Jewish identity and the Holocaust is to grapple with one of the most profoundly difficult moral issues of our century. American poet Muriel Rukeyser recognized this in 1944 when she wrote, "To be a Jew in the 20th century is to be offered a gift. If you refuse, wishing to be invisible, you choose death of the spirit, the stone, insanity. Accepting, take full life." Our speaker today has taken full life and full scholarly and intellectual commitment. Jill Robbins works in the field of comparative literature and ethics at the crossroads of literary interpretation and philosophy. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in English from Cornell University and studied in both France and Germany before taking her PhD in comparative literature at Yale University in 1985. She is currently an associate professor of English at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where she has taught since 1985, receiving numerous university awards and a fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. She has published numerous articles, including several on the concept of responsibility and aesthetics in the work of French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. In her first book, Prodigal Son, Elder Brother, Interpretation and Alterity in Augustine, Petrarch, Kafka, Levinas, Professor Robbins discusses taking the Judaic method of interpretation out of the eclipse of Western Christian culture. Her other books include 2 edited volumes, Levinas Interviews, which is forthcoming from Stanford University Press, and Theology and Philosophy in Heidegger, Derrida, Levinas from State University of New York Press. She is nearing completion of her new book titled Altered Reading, Literature and the Ethical in the Philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. It is very exciting at this conference to have the opportunity to hear the ideas of a scholar who is a rising star in this field. Please join me in welcoming Jill Robbins for her talk, The Frozen Face.
Thank you, Martha. This paper is concerned with the question of literature and art in relation to Levinas's ethical philosophy. I will show that Levinas's rejection of the work of art and his account of the violence proper to the aesthetic, which gathers around the image of the freezing or the petrification of the face, is to a large extent a response to the Holocaust. This is the case in the 1948 essay, Reality and Its Shadow, in the essays written in the 50s and the early 60s, collected in Difficult Freedom, and in the mature ethical philosophy as well, represented by the 1961 Totality and Infinity. When Levinas does speak positively about art, as he does in the essays on Agnon, Celan, Blanchot, and Laporte, written in the 60s and the 70s and collected in the volume Proper Names and on Maurice Blanchot, that art always has a relation to the Holocaust. Either it is art made by survivors, or it is art that deals with the Holocaust in some way. And this could be shown with regard to Levinas's reference in the 80s to the Soviet writer Vasily Grossman and to the visual artists Jean Atlan and Sasha Sosno. Even the 2 writers most often valorized by Levinas at various points in his career, Shakespeare and Dostoevsky, arguably are part of the canonical discussion about evil in Holocaust literary studies and serve the function of backshadowing. Hence, my aim in the remarks that follow is to explore the significance of both Levinas's rejection of and his positive valuation of art, as well as the fact that his discourse on art is, if you will, traced by the Holocaust. The issue of the relationship between ethical philosophy and literature is then, in the terms of this conference, one of literature after ethics, after the Holocaust. Levinas describes ethics as the putting into question of the self in the encounter with the face of the other. The self and its habitual economy, which represses alterity and seeks to draw it back into the same, is interrupted. That is, its tendency to grasp, to know, to possess, to see, is arrested and transformed in the face of the face, which exceeds or breaks out of the phenomenon. Not reducible to a plastic image, the face undoes the form, divests itself of its form, or, as Levinas says, the face speaks. Its expression announces "thou shalt not kill," and thereby defies the self's most primordial tendency towards pouvoir, in the double sense of power and possibility. In Levinas's work, the face-to-face encounter thus inaugurates the demand as well as the very possibility of responsibility. In this way, within a tradition of philosophy in the West whose habitual tendency is what Levinas calls an allergy to the other that remains other, Levinas restores the primacy of the forgotten question of the ethical. He renews ethics as first philosophy. It should then come as little surprise that in Totality and Infinity, the face is most emphatically not a work of art. We read, "Expression does not radiate a splendor that spreads unbeknown to the radiating being, which is perhaps the very definition of beauty." The whole burden of Levinas's discussion of facial expression is to emphasize the face's distinctive form of signification and the way it radically differs from other forms of signification. Like the trace that Levinas describes in the essay, The Trace of the Other, published 2 years later, expression denotes a referral to transcendence that is not reducible to the opposition between presence and absence, or to the play of immanence that characterizes the sign, and that belongs to an immemorial past. The face's expression signifies, Levinas says, kat auto, according to itself. It signifies directly, only with reference to itself, with an auto-signification that escapes, once again, the indirection and the referrals inherent in sign systems. Let us step back for a minute from this technical sense of expression, kat auto, to its simple meaning. Unlike other signs, facial expressions signify only themselves. They do not refer to something else, either to states of mind or feeling. The facial expression is not denotative. It's not a bit of information. It is a command, or it is a greeting. Expression, a combination of glance and speech, is the concrete way in which the face breaks out of the phenomenon. Levinas explains that there is not first a breakthrough and then a look. To break through one's form is precisely to look. A face has a meaning not by virtue of the relationships in which it is found, but out of itself. That is what expression is, and that's from Freedom and Command. It should be then clear why an aesthetic approach to the face is condemned in Totality and Infinity. It is due to the necessary plasticity of the image, and, as Levinas proposes in Reality and Its Shadow, one of the rare places where his explicit theoretical pronouncements on the aesthetic can be found, the most elementary procedure of art consists in, he says, substituting for the object its image. Every image, then, is in the last analysis plastic, and this includes the non-plastic arts of music and literature. Every artwork is, in the end, a statue, an immobile instant, an idol. Perhaps then we are in a better position to understand why in the same essay Levinas condemns art in general, although his vehemence and harshness may give pause. He writes, "The artist has given the statue a lifeless life, a derisory life, which makes the work of art something inhuman and monstrous. The aesthetic state of mind is described by Levinas as captivation, incantation, play, negative terms that he otherwise reserves for his polemic against participation, a descriptive concept developed by Levi-Bruhl to describe mythical mentality's affective relation to collective representations. Indeed, throughout most of his work, Levinas conceives of the aesthetic state of mind as participation, as a kind of false transcendence. In Totality and Infinity, which can readily be seen as a prolongation of this early negative view, he opposes poetic rapture to the sobriety of ethical discourse. He rejects the poet's imagination as caught up in the play of the same, averring that the poet who takes himself for another is incapable of ethical transcendence. In short, for Levinas, the effect of the work of art on its audience could hardly be more negative. It is described as a passivity, a loss of initiative, a passage from oneself into anonymity, whereby consciousness, paralyzed in its freedom, plays, totally absorbed in the playing. And that's from Reality and Shadow. Levinas' specific ethical charge that art petrifies the face occurs in one of 3 essays that he wrote in the 50s on the poet Paul Claudel, later collected in the volume Difficult Freedom. The fact of Levinas' intertextual engagement with Paul Claudel is significant because the poet, as a young man, had converted to Catholicism. Later in life, he wrote several poetic, personal commentaries on the Bible. These commentaries represent not an authoritative tradition of Christian exegesis, but an aesthetic response to the Old Testament on the part of a giant of French letters. Nonetheless, Levinas' essays on Claudel mark his decisive confrontation not just with Christian imaginative literature, but more significantly with the procedures of figural interpretation as well. For Claudel's exegesis of Scripture abounds in figural readings. It discovers not just the Old Testament types which prefigure and announce events and persons of the New Testament. It also finds in the Old Testament, in a gesture which cites and echoes similar exegeses by Paul, prefigurations of the prefigural relationship itself. Thus, for Claudel, Joseph is a prefiguration of the Savior. Esau and Jacob are the intertwined conflict between law and grace. Claudel writes, "The commandments from Sinai are no longer merely external to me, that is, on the tablets of stone on which I find them written. They are, in a new sense, in my heart, in my most inward sensibility, my most secret communication." End quote. Claudel even has his Moses assert, as he descends Mount Sinai with a veil over his face, "I am only a figure." Levinas asks, if all the unsullied characters in the Old Testament announce the Messiah, and all the unworthy ones, his executioners, and all the women, his mother, does not the Book of Books, obsessed by a single theme and invariably repeating the same stereotypical gestures, lose its lifelike quality? Levinas registers the fact that in the hands of Claudel, at least, the Old Testament, read figurally, is a monotonous document indeed. The type becomes stereotype. Moreover, there is a price to pay for the discovery of Old Testament types. The loss, as Levinas formulates it, is to the lifelike quality of the Old Testament, its sense of being rooted in concrete everyday situations, namely material interests, crimes, jealousy, hatred, murder, that even fraternity does not resolve. That's from Difficult Freedom. Levinas's wording further implies that what is lost is not just the lifelike quality of the Old Testament, but life itself, its living life, sa vie vivante. The Old Testament is thus killed off by figural interpretation, is perhaps rendered truly, and for the first time, a dead letter. But there are other losses that figural interpretation incurs when it reads the Bible as a procession of types, a repertory of figures. The Christian emphasis on the otherworldly is at the expense of the Bible's reference to this life, which, says Levinas, is conscience. He comments, "History is not a perpetual test with a diploma of eternal life as its goal, but the very element in which the life of spirit moves." In short, the reference to the interhuman, to this life, is precisely what is most specific to Judaism and to the Judaic reading of the Bible. For even when figural interpretation does represent the interhuman, a loss of historicity results. As Levinas puts it, quote, "The relationship which man holds with himself and with his neighbors appear frozen, figé, unalterable, eternal," end quote. The problem seems to go even further than figural interpretation's manner of representing the interhuman. It has to do with the possibility of representing it at all. To represent the rapport between persons is to freeze it. In short, to aestheticize these rapports is to cover up the ethical. The very complicity between Christianity and the aesthetic turns the Bible into, quote, "a world of figures instead of a world of faces," unquote. And we distrust this theater, this petrification of our faces, writes Levinas. Here, figural interpretation is not merely said to freeze the rapport between persons. It freezes the persons themselves. It turns them into, Levinas will assert, figure men or statue men. It petrifies the face. This charge could not be more serious, for if in Levinas's work the encounter with the other's face is the irreducible experience of what is called ethics, to speak of the petrification of the face is to announce an event which, within the terms of Levinas's ethical thought, is one of the worst things that could happen. It would be a violence directed at the face, the essential characteristic of which is, we have said, mobility. If the face in Levinas's descriptions is not reducible to a plastic image, to a surface or mask, that is largely because it is always on the move, divesting itself of its form, interpolating the self with its expression, speaking a primordial speech. Hence, the petrification of the face would do violence to the very possibility of the ethical's arising. It would put a stop to the ethical at the level of its condition of possibility. This is a violence which, because it would occur on this originary level, could serve as an alibi for all violent action. Suffice it to remark that if, in the Levinasian ethics, there is a privilege of the spatial figure of facing, there is, in the Levinasian account of violence, a corresponding disprivileging of the angle. Any oblique encounter with the other is a form of violence. In Freedom and Commandment from 1951, in an early version of the murder analysis, Levinas writes, "Violence consists in ignoring this opposition, ignoring the face of a being, avoiding the gaze, and catching sight of an angle whereby the no inscribed on a face, by the very fact that it is a face, becomes a hostile or submissive force. Violence is a way of acting on every being and every freedom by approaching it from an indirect angle." End quote. And Maurice Blanchot paraphrases what Levinas is describing when he says, "Murder takes the infinity by which autrui presents himself as if it were a property of autrui and wishes to reject it absolutely. Thereby it misses him. It changes him into absence, but does not touch him." End quote. And this mistake, namely the substitution of an infinity target for infinity as a mode of revelation, comes from catching sight of the face from an angle. It comes from indirection. Now, there's not the space here to discuss the way in which rhetoric, denigrated in totality infinity as ruse, emprise, and exploitation, is also said to have an angle on the other. Rhetoric approaches the other, quote, "not to face him, but obliquely," unquote. The deviousness of rhetoric is always opposed in Levinas's discourse to the straightforwardness, the uprightness, the droiture of the ethical language with the face. Suffice it to say that when Levinas uses the geometrical figure of the oblique, he means avoiding the demand of the face-to-face. To approach the other from an angle, like the freezing action that figural interpretation effects with regard to face, thus, is not only to lose the other's face, but always also to lose one's own face. Claudel's figural reading loses face in this double sense, when the Old Testament is said to prefigure and thus to charge itself with deicide. Quote, Cain represents a certain kind of prefiguration of the Jewish people, the assassin of God, end quote. Now, such an anti-Judaic reading may be an occupational hazard of figural interpretation, and especially in its patristic form, but when such a reading is advanced in 1949, that is, after Auschwitz, it is, says Levinas, discourteous of our troubles. I might add that when Claudel, the subsequent year, published another biblical commentary, he did not do much better. That text lines up Auschwitz with the cultic sacrificial offerings in ancient Israel. At Auschwitz, says Claudel, Israel, instead of sacrificing, became the sacrifice. It thus illuminates the meaning of Christ's expiatory death, which, as the firstborn of God, it had always shown the light of, but could not see it itself, blind as it was to the Christian proclamation. So the synagogue thus remains mysteriously faithful to its pre- and post-figural role as the elder brother of the church, to its priority, which is, says Claudel, its capital. In brief, this reading is not only deeply objectionable, it is, in Levinas's words, hallucinatory. Levinas's essay on this text was later included in a volume of the Cahiers de Paul Claudel, which sought to come to terms with Claudel's evolving perspective on the figure of Israel. Now I turn now to those places in Levinas's work where he attributes a positive ethical significance to art. Proper Names is a collection of essays on other authors, many of them literary. The proper names to which the title refers are, as Levinas glosses them in the volume's 1976 preface, the names of persons whose saying signifies a face. That is, these are writers who give to think the ethical. The preface opposes these proper names to, quote, the common names and the commonplaces of structuralism and post-structuralism. And Levinas's examples are the death of God, the play of signifiers without signifieds, psychoanalytic speculations, which Levinas dismisses as bavardage à la mode. Then, in an argumentative mood, and with a question that can also be found in the 1970 essay, No Identity, Levinas asks, but can't we see in the end of a certain intelligibility the dawn of another? Namely, the end of an intelligibility which reaches its apotheosis in the ultimate identity, quote, of the identical and the non-identical, unquote, affirmed by Hegel. Again, as in No Identity, the fact that Levinas seeks precisely to put into question the metaphysics of identity affirms, despite his protests, the very convergence between the post-structuralist, or in this case the Derridian critique of the presence of the present, and his own thinking of the ethical. This new intelligibility, Levinas states, is not the consciousness of self, but the relation with the other. Not the said, it is the saying, which always carves out a passage from the same to the other. The saying and the said is a correlative relation that corresponds roughly to the difference between the kind of speech which foregrounds the relation to its addressee, namely which is interlocutionary and ethical, and a denotative speaking, which is more like a speaking about the other than speaking to him or her, and in which the saying congeals into the thematization of the said. Suffice it to note that here, too, it is a question of an orientation that should be mobile, freezing up, an ethical signification that is neutralized. In the 1972 essay on Paul Celan, Levinas claims that the poem in Celan goes toward the other, that there is in Celan's work an attempt to think transcendence. One of Celan's achievements for Levinas is the way in which his work interrupts, I quote, the ludic order of the beautiful. Similarly, the alterities to which Maurice Blanchot points in his literary critical and in his narrative prose are said to have an ethical significance, even if that significance is not made explicit. In the case of Roger Laporte, whose work follows closely upon the example of Blanchot, Levinas asserts, quote, language is the fact that a single word is proffered. God, unquote. In each of these essays, the structure of the saying and the said is evoked, and the literary authors are credited with resisting the immobilization of the said in the saying. The very literary authors who traffic in the figured sense of language. This is remarkable to the extent that the classical theory of metaphor, understood since Aristotle as an analogy between two objects based on their resemblance, assumes that metaphor necessarily relies on a knowledge of essences. That would consign the improper naming that is metaphor to the realm of the said. But Levinas's counterclaim that art, usually excoriated as a form of non-responsibility, can be ethical, and ethical in his precise sense of the term, that is, not an ethics, but an ultra-ethics, an ethics that has an opening function, is remarkable in another way, in that it negotiates the incommensurability that prevented art from ever being originary in the first place, from being originary enough in the first place to be ethical. Levinas's intertextual engagement with the modern Hebrew writer, S.Y. Agnon, my last example here, provides yet another instance of far-reaching ethical claims as regards a literary work. It also provides an instance of Levinas's decisive confrontation with Hebrew imaginative writing. The essay on Agnon, entitled Poetry and Resurrection, written in 1973, 7 years after Agnon received the Nobel Prize for Literature and 3 years after Agnon's death, begins by establishing what Levinas elsewhere calls the ontological reference to the book in Judaism, exemplified by the relation to Scripture. Of the ceaseless auto-reference in Agnon to writing, inscription, the materiality of books, paper, bindings, the collecting, preservation, and transmission of texts, Levinas writes, Agnon's language and the life it lets speak, whether in its wholeness or in its disintegration, all that is referred to books, loses itself there, or issues from them. It all goes back to a past concerning which we are justified in wondering whether it ever could have been contained within a present. Referring to Agnon's tendency in the modern, resuscitated Hebrew language to use biblical turns of phrase with no quotation marks for the experienced reader, Levinas also asserts the ambiguity, or what he calls the enigma, of the Hebrew word, which signifies, quote, both in the context of the passage in which it occurs and in counterpoint in the scriptural context oriented toward an unrepresentable past. Levinas describes, in effect, an eminently midrashic procedure of reading one scriptural verse in relation to another verse, often its most distant scriptural neighbor. And one can link onto this midrashic tendency to bring concerns, the midrashic tendency to bring concerns of the past, concerns of the present into a relation with the text of the past, along with Agnon's own way of letting the biblical word resound in the modern language. Levinas describes this as being, quote, like an echo anticipating the sound of a voice, a footprint preceding the step, unquote, and lest we have any doubt about what such anachronistic figures, namely an echo preceding the voice, the footprint preceding the step, mean, lest we have any doubt about what gestures toward an unrepresentable and immemorial past, a past so past that it can never come into the form of the present, Levinas states, such is the enigmatic modality of a resuscitated language, beginning again with its own trace, unquote. Agnon's writing, then, is said, especially in its quasi-midrashic diction, to have a trace structure, that is, to have the distinctive form of signification in retreat, which, in the idiom of Levinas's later work, is precisely the way in which the other signifies. Levinas asks, is this a marvel of the imagination? But imagination, he recalls, quote, is the presence of images which represent the substratum of being, unquote. The question is, could the specificity of the Jewish imagination be in its ability to indicate an unrepresentable past? I wish to attend to one last claim that Levinas advances with regard to Agnon's depiction of Jewish life, mind you, in its wholeness or in its disintegration, that speaks to this very question. That is the claim that Jewish ritual life, quote, breaks away from a certain ontology. And here I quote again. It attests to that unrepresentable past through ritual that pervades the material gestures of existence, which have been diverted from their natural ends towards the symbol. It is as if the land meant nothing but the promise of land, as if the body and its organs had been created to carry out the commandments. It is a life that, properly speaking, does not make up a world. Religion, or more precisely, Judaism, would be the way in which a desubstantiation of being is itself procured. The symbolism of the rite, like the enigma of the Hebraic word, denucleates the ultimate solidity beneath the plasticity of forms as taught by Western ontology, end quote. This reading of Jewish ritual life comes very close to the reflections Levinas had offered 20 years earlier in the essays collected in Difficult Freedom. As in that work, these assertions are part of a complex hermeneutic of Judaism. To put it briefly, the whole reason that the question of the ethical had to be renewed in the first place was that it had been covered up or repressed within the Western philosophical tradition that was habitually a philosophy that privileges the same. For the ethical structures that Levinas delineates go against the grain of the dominant philosophical conceptuality. The habitual tendency of the self, we recall, seeks to suppress alterity. First of all, and most of the time, my tendency is murderous toward the other, and that is what is interrupted. That is the tendency that is interrupted by the encounter with the face. Now, in the terms of his later work, Levinas similarly presupposes what Spinoza called the conatus essendi, namely the essential tendency of a being to persist in its being. He necessarily presupposes the order of ontology and its attendant violences. He presupposes substantification, which he also refers to as the solidity of the substratum, as the very way of the world. He must presuppose what he will describe to be interrupted. That is why when Levinas interprets Judaic religion, he has to critically retrieve its true significance beneath the negative and privative determinations that the West assigns it. The access to Hebrew writing and ethical thought, then, is never immediately given. In order to delineate the alternative intelligibility of Judaic religion, he must go by way of the dominant conceptuality and a specifically Greek philosophical language of the phenomenon, being, and substance. That is why he describes Judaic religion as a desubstantiation of being, as a certain escape from ontology. That is why he asserts that its life, quote, does not make up a world, since world is always thought together, I take it, with being. And one will find in the Ceylon essay a similar description of Judaism as an expulsion from the mundanity or the worldhood of the world. It is in this spirit that we might take Levinas's assertion in the same passage in the Agnon essay that Judaism proposes an excluded middle, quote, in which the limits between life and non-life disappear, unquote. An excluded middle in which the limits between life and non-life disappear. The Agnon story to which Levinas refers, The Sign, written in 1962, begins with the words, "In the year when the news reached us that all the Jews in my town had been killed, I was living in a certain section of Jerusalem," unquote. Now, Agnon's story revolves around a narrator who is constricted emotionally. He's unable to weep in the synagogue and in the poetic form of a lament. The story shifts between past and present, and it is organized, Levinas's reading suggests, around the crossing of the values of life and death. Levinas writes, "Life is in death, death in life. The festival commemorating the giving of the Torah is placed at the heart of a nameless mourning, and deuil sans nom." And this phrasing recalls the title of Proper Name's final essay, Sans nom, nameless, originally published under the title Honor Without a Flag, an essay which is about the Holocaust and which is in the anomalous position of being the only essay in the volume not arranged alphabetically, as there are the other proper names. Levinas goes on to cite from Agnon's story, "And as for me, I found myself in the middle of my town as if the time of the resurrection of the dead had come. Great is the day of the resurrection of the dead. I felt a taste of it that day as I stood among my dead brothers and my fellow townspeople who have gone to another world. And they stood before me as they were during their lives in all the synagogues and houses of prayer in my town. Standing there, feeling worried, I gazed at the inhabitants of my town, and there was no hint of reproach in their eyes due to the fact that I was like this and they were like that." End quote. The narrator, remarks Levinas, sees the inhabitants of his town, quote, again in their absolute place, a place that is not a site, not a landscape into which human beings blend, a place that is their place in the synagogues of the vanished town, in which presence is elevation, in which place is already non-place. There is equality between the dead and the living, except that, in Agnon's words, some are like this and some are like that. Levinas continues, in their places, at their posts, beyond their own essences, no longer speaking in the first person, yet still speaking to us, unquote. Hence, when Levinas describes Judaism as an excluded middle in which the limits between life and non-life disappear, he does not mean a logic of opposition. He means an ambiguity that allows for and ultimately disallows the opposition. Moreover, the excluded middle between life and non-life that Judaism proposes is a place constituted by Jewish liturgy, Jewish ritual life, which, for Levinas, recognizes in ethics a signification that is, quote, stronger than death, unquote. To sum up then, why, after renouncing art, does Levinas make an exception? Because of the Holocaust, art is rejected as insufficient. Because of the Holocaust, art is said to be ethical. Is this simply a contradiction? An instance of Jewish chauvinism? An indication that Levinas has changed his mind? Or could not his position on art be itself understood as an excluded middle between something that ethical philosophy has no need for, and also cannot do without. To say that that Holocaust art is no longer art, or is art at the limit of art, would be to beg the question of why Levinas makes an exception in the case of Agnon and others. But surely the art that makes the difference here can no longer be conceived as aesthetic. Thank you. Do you want me to sit down?
Professor Robbins has agreed to take questions from the floor. Because of the telecast, we will ask that you raise your hand and please hold your question until the microphone reaches you so that your question can be heard by the television audience also. So let me begin by asking one first question, and that's, Professor Robbins, does a literary text have alterity in the same way that the other person does? And then I'll let you field the question.
Well, I guess to that Levinas would say no. Since he thinks the primacy of the ethical, he necessarily secondarizes everything else, other alterities, even the alterity of the literary, if one can speak of such a thing. At the same time, it would be possible to conceive of an extension of Levinas's ethical thought in the direction of not just hermeneutics, but also reading, that would try to think the alterity of the literary as something that has a profound relationship with what Levinas calls ethics.
I found this extremely provocative, but I want to provoke you because I don't know if it's your intention, but it does seem to me that you leave us with an extraordinary paradox. So I'm going to put my question in almost an accusatory manner, not to you, but to Levinas, because I want to see how you answer it. One might say, on the basis of your analysis, that Levinas, who has been so sensitive to the issue of what he calls ontological imperialism and of the violence that is done when we impose ontological categories on the infinite or the transcendent, seems to be guilty of an analogous violence in speaking about art and the aesthetic. Because the entire analysis that you gave is always measuring the aesthetic and art from the perspective of these ethical. The original condemnation or the criticism is because it isn't ethical. That's what it comes to. And even when you come to the apologia is based on the fact, nevertheless, it can be. But why not say to Levinas, you warn us not to do, to be careful, not to murder, not to kill, that what you are in effect doing is being ethically imperialistic when it comes to the aesthetic and art.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. I would readily concur that Levinas does not do justice to literary texts for the most part. He tends, and he is not alone among philosophers, to reduce the text to its denotative meaning and have it serve as illustration of a philosophical argument generally. And it's possible to examine those literary instances, particularly of citation in Levinas's work, and how he is, at the moment when he thinks he's reading an author, that author may also be reading him. There's something the literary text knows that Levinas perhaps doesn't always know. At the same time, I don't want to dilute the importance of Levinas's insight that there is something about art that is profoundly unethical. And I think we want to take this claim seriously as well, and not rush into a celebration of art that is carries along with it privileging of art in the aesthetic sense, namely as a kind of cognition, something that is phenomenally accessible, the ideology of the masterpiece, and so on. I suppose I'm of two minds, like Levinas, on this question. First, the gentleman in the behind you.
How would you understand his reading of Talmudic texts, particularly because he reads specifically Agadic texts, which might be considered art, as it were, and yet allows for a different kind of reading where it never freezes, because there is this dialogue that's taking place all the time, both between Agadah and Halacha, and even within the Agadah itself. So, in a sense, it's a very different reading of the literary through the Midrashic. How would that relate to your discussion?
I think Levinas does a great job with the Talmudic text. Would that he lavished the same care, attention to every word, every syllable, every diacritical mark when he reads a literary text. And I think many of us who work in literature have made this something of an article of faith, that one is bound, responsible to read very closely in a way that I think the rabbis can help teach us. As for Haggadah, I think that there is, for Levinas, something certainly about the Jewish literary tradition, and by that we mean the Bible and the Talmud primarily. And when Levinas refers to the literature that Levinas really, the only literature practically that Levinas will admit to liking is the literature of the Bible. And like Holocaust art, that's kind of literature at the limit of literature, and so on. Haggadah, Levinas, somehow the whole form of rabbinic study is well suited to the preservation of the alterity of the text at hand and to the alterity of the other. The words are at once fixed, yet the study tradition is fluid and the interpretations are open-ended. He likes that combination, that there's a kind of fixedness of the text, but it only looks like an immobility because the text is never read without the interpretive tradition as well. I don't know if I'd want to go so far as to call art the Haggadah, the art of the Bible, of the Talmud, but there is a hint in some of this Agnon material that the specific forms of the Jewish literary imagination would precisely have a specificity, would not be, strictly speaking, what we think of as imagination, and would avoid a lot of the pitfalls that Levinas attributes to most artistic representation. I dare say that would be partly a result of, due to the anti-iconic tendency within Judaism and so on, but this is an area that needs to be explored. And I've always liked the article by Jeffrey Hartman called The Jewish Imagination on this subject. I think he's clearing some new ground there. Sandy.
Hi, Jill, I wanted to first thank you for drawing our attention to this less discussed part of Levinas, which I think for those of us who work in literary criticism is nonetheless extremely important. I wonder if it would be helpful to imagine what you're saying in terms of the notion of a witness. That is to say, you say that for Levinas, art, when viewed in a positive manner, has a trace structure. It makes me think that in some way he understands art as linked to the saying, and that being linked to saying is linked to witness. That is to say, is there a way in which the art that he finds positive is an art that escapes representation precisely in the manner that witness escapes representation, which is to say, not as the other of representation, but as something that is otherwise than representation?
Thanks, Sandy. I think that's an interesting direction, very interesting direction of thought. I would say, though, and you might have noticed from my rather rigid and tentative, the way I talked about the saying and the said, that I really don't want to take for granted that we know what we mean by the saying. I mentioned it's a correlative structure because, strictly speaking, it's not going to, the saying is not going to happen without the said. I think a lot of readers of Levinas, very well-intentioned, have grabbed at this notion of the saying as if they understand, as if they know what it means. I don't know what would authorize us to assume that literature is involved with the saying. I don't think I'd know a saying if I came across it. I'm not even sure I'm ever in the presence of the saying, actually. Even if I greet you in the hallway, I'm not sure that's a saying. So I really want to hold back from making claims that art would have access to that. I simply tried to link the saying to the general emphasis on ethical language and totality infinity that stressed the vocative, conative, and interlocutionary qualities of language, and it seems to be a mobile relation to the addressee that is at issue. But I don't think we should understand this anthropomorphically or anything else, so I'm at a loss to say more about it. Yeah.
It would be a way of trying to find the infinite within literature, which would be at least the nature of the problem.
That's interesting, thank you. The gentleman in the green shirt.
Let me invite you out on a limb. Do you think that this analysis sheds light on the current public debates of the effect of popular art, if art even applies, on television and books and so on issues like mistreatment of women, tolerance or comfortableness with the most vicious forms of violence? Do you see a connection there from this analysis?
It's difficult for me to comment on that, I think, because I am taking my lead from Levinas, whose analysis of violence takes place on a more originary level than any particular violence is. The situation I'm trying to describe has to be understood as something like the alibi for all possible violences. But one really does need to ask, what is violence, if it can happen on the originary level? And what is ontology, if it can be violent, and so on? So that's how I would relay that question. Probably not to your best satisfaction, but Bob?
I was wondering if we could try a certain distribution of the analysis you've given of literary texts, Levinas's interpretation, to plastic art and to sculpture, and whether it would be possible to make a claim that it's also possible to have good plastic images as opposed to those awful frozen ones. And specifically, obviously, that's important. If the good literary ones are about the Shoah, then would the good plastic ones possibly be memorial? And there's a second little bit that I'll show my hand, which is that it seems to me that the question of inscription and mobility, the argument about inscription and mobility could be in some ways repeated in terms of plastic art, that just because it's inscribed, just because it's carved out, doesn't mean that it's necessarily immobile.
Sorry, did you say inscription and mobility or immobility?
Well, the charge of immobility, if we can save the literary text, then conceivably we might be able to save the plastic artifact.
To the first question, actually, yes, on both counts. There would be good plastic images, and I suppose I think it would be interesting to look carefully at the artists that Levinas has chosen to write the catalogs for, like Jean Atlan is a survivor and was in a camp during the war. I guess he simulated madness. He got out, he began to paint, and that's how he survived. His work is very abstract and conceptual. It's certainly figurative painting or non-representational, I guess. So Levinas could give a thumbs up to that. Now, what are we going to do about sculpture? Ultimately, probably, and if I knew how to talk about this, but I'm hoping maybe that you do, that inscription, if one understood how to read sculpture, as Paul de Man used to say, then perhaps one could think about this relation between inscription and immobility, precisely. And there is an instance in Levinas's work where he says, look, I can get the alterity of the other out of, I think it's an arm of a Rodin statue. So when we think about the figures for the face that are okay, face is a kind of, it wouldn't be a synecdoche, of course, or a prosopopeia, but what can stand in for, instead of face, if there's any other privileged synecdochic figures. Similarly, there's a reference in the Vasily Grossman discussions to the back of the neck, that can give to think alterity too. And this is a kind of thing that's going to probably disrupt my entire argument. Yeah.
What a note to leave it on. Thank you for your questions, and I want to thank Professor Robbins again. For the benefit of our television audience, I want you to know that our next telecast will be the keynote address of Professor Emil Fackenheim at 8 o'clock this evening. If you are watching on TCI, Professor Fackenheim's speech will be shown Thursday evening at 8 o'clock. And now please join me in thanking Professor Jill Robbins.